I talked a little bit about good and bad difficulty with regards to Fallout. And the other type of difficulty, because, well, I suppose like the thing with Fallout and games like that is like Skyrim and quite a few other games these days, they let you change your difficulty settings whenever you want. So maybe you start the game on like the hardest difficulty and then you realize like, okay, this is actually way too challenging for me. And then you turn it down to make to make a fight easier for yourself or whatever. You have a lot of these games, you have the ability to like turn it down 1 second and then turn it back up again if you want, so you can just get through maybe like a particularly grindy moment or something. And it's an interesting one. I imagine it's like kind of controversial. Personally, I don't really care. Like, I think that's fine. I don't really have strong opinions about the ability to change your difficulty settings whenever you want. Except that, I think what I do like in games is that sometimes they'll attach like an achievement to hard, or like beating it on hard or normal or whatever the hell. And it'll be like, if you change the difficulty at any point during your run, then you lose the ability to get that achievement. And I think that at least rewards people who play through on the hardest difficulty, which I think is kind of nice, because it makes it feel like, well, if you want to play through on hard, then you get this little reward, and it makes you feel like you've gotten the full experience of the game at that difficulty level as it was designed. And then other people who don't really care about achievements, they can just shift their difficulty around like as and when they please. So I think there are good middle grounds you can have with that kind of system. And to me, that's like overall a pretty decent system for a game.
I think this is a surprisingly deep topic as a designer, because at the heart of it, you have this question of, how do I stop my player from ruining their own experience, which they just love to do? So on a surface level, this is a solution to that, because I could pick the hardest difficulty and then suck at the game and then think the game is unfair and stupid, and then I quit the game and I don't play it, and I ruin my own experience of the game because I just bit off more than I could chew and refused to change or start over and lose and lose all my progress, right? I'm like, oh, I'm like already an hour in. I don't want to start another game on normal and do this hour again. So to avoid that, this seems like a clever solution, but you've now introduced this hurdle where players can ruin the game for themselves in a different way, where anytime they face something even remotely challenging, they could just put the game down to easy, steamroll it, and then put it back up. And you would hope that people would use that responsibly, and I'm sure some will, but some people might, just the very fact that they can do that kind of rob them of the stakes of the game, and they lose interest in it. Because nothing actually is ever challenging, because it can just be kind of turned off. You know, it's like the second you give someone the cheat code that gives them invincibility, they'll use it, and then they'll have fun for like 5 minutes, and then they'll just be bored of the game and turn it off completely, rather than just turn off the invincibility cheat. I find myself in those situations. I'm like, well, I'm done with this game, instead of being done with the cheat. So I worry about that aspect of it, but I do love that it addresses the FOMO issue, at least, of like getting scared on the difficulty selection screen that I better nail this or I'm going to have a worse experience. So knowing I can change it whenever, very comforting, but also very concerning that I could ruin the fun for myself when given that power. So yeah, I don't know. It's a nice middle ground, but I'm not sure what the right answer is ultimately, or if there is one.
Yeah, and I would wonder if the type of player to play through the game on hard and then turn it down for every boss to easy and then turn it back up to hard right after is the kind of player to complain that the bosses were too difficult. Or like it would become a point of complaint for them. The bosses were too hard. But they're not gonna note that they've altered the game experience.
Right.
Themselves. Like, they're not gonna note that, well, I could have played it on a lower difficulty, but instead I kept it at hard and then I continually turned it down. And they won't put any of the onus on themselves. It'll still be a developer issue, you know? So I wonder how much it solves the problem for those types of people anyway.
And those people are robbing themselves of skill building moments and learning, fighting the bosses on the difficulty that they're on, so they're not kind of heading up that line graph curve, getting better at the game as the game gets harder. So the boss battles become always too hard for them, and even harder and harder as they come in, leading them to believe, man, the boss battles are so unbalanced compared to the other parts of the game. But they've been practicing the other parts of the game on a hard difficulty, and then cheesing the boss fights on easy where they didn't have to learn anything. And you're getting these now false reports of the difficulty of the game, and it's because the player's playing the friggin' game wrong again. I hate it when people do that.
Well, also they're likely, like, obviously this is a fake scenario. We don't know how many people actually do this kind of thing.
But we hate all of them.
But if a player were to do that, like, you would assume in a game like that, the bosses are gonna be harder than the base gameplay. Because that's usually how a boss fight works. It's like, you've learned how to do these things, now put them into practice against something more difficult. They're meant to be these points of interest, these moments of challenge. You know, the things that you talk about in a game a lot of the time are going to be the boss fights. So, this player who's, like, able to switch their difficulty up and down, they get to this boss fight and then they think it's imbalance, that the boss is too hard, rather than a natural spike in difficulty that's intentional, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, that could definitely happen. And that's kind of best case scenario, because I'm assuming that's a game that sort of does the Dark Souls thing where combat is kind of extended into boss combat. Like, you handle boss combat differently, but you're executing the same skills. So it's kind of built, it's like combat plus when you're in a boss fight. But there's games where the boss fights could be testing skills that have nothing to do with the rest of the game. It could be like a totally separate part of the experience. And so in those cases, what you're describing just gets even worse.
Oh man, you just reminded me of this boss in Metroid Prime where you have to do the whole boss as a morph ball. Brutal. Fuck that boss, that's all I'll say.